Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Carrie Marsh, and I'm the director of the Clark Historical Library, and it's so great to see all of you here this evening. It's an honor to welcome you to this evening's Clark Speaker Series event. We'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that we are here on the beautiful lands maintained for generations by the Anishinaabe people, the indigenous inhabitants of Michigan. We acknowledge their stewardship and our contemporary partnership with our neighbors and partners, the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe. Before we meet this evening's speaker, I have just two announcements. First, this evening's talk is being recorded. So during the Q&A after the presentation, if you'll raise your hand, I'll pass you a microphone. You can ask your question then. And I hope you all will join us in the Clark Historical Library for a reception and book signing after tonight's presentation. And our this evening's speaker brought some really cool objects that are used for wild ricing and that are sitting out on a table that for all of you to look at as well. So please join us after the talk in the reception. So it's a pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Barbara Barton. Barb Barton is best described as a Renaissance woman. She's an award-winning singer-songwriter, author, and filmmaker. She's also an endangered species biologist, beekeeper, and wild foods forager. Barb practices and teaches traditional living skills of self-sufficiency, a lifestyle she says keeps her in close relationships with nature. On any given day, you can find her gathering wild foods and medicines, processing acorns to make flour, tapping black walnut trees for syrup, making maple sugar and vinegar, shelling nuts, or harvesting and processing wild rice. If you have a cup of coffee with her, you should know she roasted the beans herself. That coffee cake you were served with your coffee is made from a 40-year-old sourdough starter Barb inherited from her grandmother, about which I am extremely envious. Today, Barb will share with us her award-winning book, Manoomin, the Story of Wild Rice in Michigan, which brings forward the rich tradition of wild rice in our state and its importance to the Anishinaabe people who live here. Among the awards that Manoomin the book has won include a Michigan History Award, a Michigan Notable Book Award, an American Library Association Choice List of Outstanding Academic Titles recognition, and an Independent Publisher's Bronze Medal. So please join me in welcoming Barbara Barton.
Thank you. Yep. I think so. Everybody hear me okay? You gonna turn it up back here? It's hiding. Labs always hide. Testing, testing. Everybody hear me better now? All right. Ani Buju, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. Really happy to share with you some things that I have learned in my years of working with Manoomin. And I have to start off my talk always with acknowledging those people who shared their knowledge with me. I was introduced to wild foods by my great-grandparents and my parents and my grandparents ever since I was, well, I'm 2 in this picture down here on the right. And I'm really grateful to them for sharing their knowledge with me. And I also want to thank Roger Labin from the Lac Vieux Desert tribe up in the western UP. He introduced me to Manoomin back in 2008, and we've worked together ever since. He's like a brother to me, and I really appreciate his hard work on behalf of Manoomin. So how many of you have met Manoomin before or went ricing? Anybody? I've been a biologist my whole career. I got my undergrad in the 80s and my master's in the mid-2000s. And I never heard of this plant before, 2008, which blows my mind. So that says one of two things. Either it isn't around, or the Western education system is lacking in knowledge about sacred plants to the Anishinaabe people. But I want to introduce you to the two species that we have here in Michigan. The rice you see growing on the river is called river rice, Zizania aquatica. It's a threatened species here in Michigan, meaning it's protected by law. It grows mostly in the southern part of the state. And the picture where Roger and I are ricing is from Tawas Lake, and that is lake rice, or Zizania palestris. One of the big differences in these two plants is the river rice grows extremely tall. It can grow up to 12, 13 feet high, and it has a lot broader leaves. Kind of the stalks are thicker. As you can imagine, living on a river, you have a bit more force coming your way with the water than if you're in a lake. And when you're in the presence of this plant, you know you're with something very special. It's absolutely, to me, hands down, the most beautiful plant I have ever seen. The life story of Manoomin is also pretty fascinating. In the wintertime, the seeds, which had fallen in the fall, are embedded down in the sediment of the water, and they stay there until the ice breaks in the spring. Then the plant will grow and go into what's called the floating leaf stage, which you can see up here in the upper right. At that stage is really vulnerable to things like boats coming by, floods on the river, because the roots have not grown down into the sediment yet and established and anchored the plant. As the summer goes on into July, it'll start to produce flowers, and it's become an emergent plant like a cattail. It stands up in the water. And then by late August, early September, the grains are ready for harvesting and for feeding the birds. I will say right off the bat, I am not an indigenous person. These teachings that were shared with me were done by Roger, Charlie Fox, and several other elders. And I want to just mention to you the migration story very briefly, so that you have a sense of why this is so important to the Anishinaabe. So the old stories tell about the people being visited by 8 prophets. Originally, the Anishinaabe people lived up in the New Brunswick, Maine area, as you can see from this map. And the prophets foretold of people who are from across the big water coming across, and that if they didn't leave, they would be destroyed. So they were told to travel westward to the place where the food grows on the water. So thus began the long migration, and eventually the tribal folks here, Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe, came to the Great Lakes region and found wild rice, or Manoomin. And that's why some of you folks, as you know, are here today. So the traditions that evolved from Manoomin include rice camps. And traditionally, in areas where these traditions weren't interrupted by the boarding school era and relocation and the destruction of wild rice, people and communities would harvest as family. They'd harvest together and do the processing. It's a lot of work to process wild rice. The camps that you see here photos of, these are from Lac Vieux Desert, back at the early camps in 2000, I think this might be 2010, where folks would come from all over Lake Superior region to learn how to do the make ricing sticks and push poles. They learn about the cultural traditions from Roger and Charlie and their family. We would learn about how to do restoration, how to pull the canoe, how to harvest the rice. So those are wonderful learning opportunities, and every Labor Day weekend, Keweenaw Bay Indian Community hosts a rice camp that's open to everyone. So you can, if you're interested, you can go up there and learn a lot of these teachings. Now, harvesting rice on the lake is a lot easier than harvesting rice on the river. You can see how tall these plants are. if you try to bend one over with a ricing stick, the plant will break. And not only that, the seed head at the very top is way over there in somebody else's canoe. So you can see this gentleman here has a hooked stick, and what you do is you slide it up to the top of the stalk and gently pull it over, and you can get the rice that way. So one of the things that they do on these dense river rice beds is put boards through the rice bed and walk out into it and collect it that way. This photo is from the Nottawasepi Huron Band. So I wanted to show you kind of what the process of ricing looks like, and also what the final finishing table looks like at a rice camp. So this is on Lake Rice. This is up at Lac Vieux Desert. This is Charlie Ba Fox and his wife Terry. I put this my phone on my bottom of the canoe facing up and did a slow-mo of the rice dropping into the canoe as it's knocked in. So you can see we're using ricing sticks made out of cedar, and only the ripe grains are falling from the stalk of the plant. You don't want to knock green rice in because it's not going to ripen. So this way, you just get the rice that is ripe, and you can come back through in a couple days and harvest again because the seeds ripen at different times. So what do you have to do once you get the rice knocked into the canoe? You take it back to shore, you lay it out in tarps to dry in the sun, because the whole goal is you have to get at the seed, at the grain inside, right? So you have to get the hull off. So this is a process called parching. This is what will dry the hull in order to get it off the grain. And then the last step is actually removing the hull from the grain. So now he's winnowing to get the chaff. So that's the final finishing table. And to me, that's the favorite place to be at rice camp, because everybody's there seeing each other, people they haven't seen for a year. Everyone's laughing, telling jokes, passing on stories. Elders are teaching the kids who got put there because they were like horsing around or something, and they had to sit and pick rice for a while to think about their ways. But one of the things that happened after I attended the first rice camp was, being a biologist, I asked the question, where is all the rice? And is it common? I just don't know it. Is it rare? So I began a journey to try to find in the European literature every mention of rice that I could, and also to find every rice bed that existed today in order to document it and to see if it in fact was as rare as I thought. The first thing I did was back in 2000, I think it was 2009, I met with all the natural resources staff people in all the tribes and talked with them about Manoomin. And then I started looking at herbarium specimens. I went into the literature and looked at old newspapers and books and county atlases and on and on and on, trying to find any mention of wild rice here. The very first written accounts, or the very first accounts of rice that have been found historically, come from the archaeological field. There are 13 sites in Michigan where they have found what are called phytoliths. And phytoliths are made of silica. They're very, very small. And each plant has a unique pattern. So you can tell when you find one of these what plant it's from. And so if they would be looking at areas that were previously occupied, tribal village or camp or something, they'd find a food cache or cooking area, they might find phytoliths or seeds or fragments of wild rice. And indeed, 13 sites in Michigan had wild rice, and these sites were over 2,000 years old. Well, I started to work on a map, and each dot, I mean, if you look at these dots, they're like, well, big deal. But I tell you how many years it took to create these maps and these dots. These are living maps, right? I don't have all of the sites on here. I don't know all of the sites. There's been new sites that have been found, and some folks prefer to keep them private, which is totally understandable. So at the time of writing of this book, there were 198 historical sites that I was able to find exact locations for. There were many references in the books that talked about Michigan being full of wild rice, that all the rivers were full of rice and you couldn't pass through them, but they weren't specific enough to put a point on a map. And I was able to find records of 145 sites that are in existence today. Now, you would think some of those would be historic sites too. Only 6 of the sites that I know of today are in that list of historic sites. So that tells you how many we've lost. And we've lost enormous wild rice beds. Saginaw Bay, based on my research, had over 10,000 acres of wild rice. The only place left that there's rice that I know of is Wildfowl Bay. And on a good year, there was about 200 acres. Monroe Marsh at the mouth of the River Raisin had a 4,000 to 5,000 acre wild rice bed, completely gone. St. Clair Flat still has some rice, but nothing near the 2,000 acres that was once there. Even Houghton Lake had a mile-long rice bed at one time. It has some rice now, but for the most part, it's gone as well. Now for the happy part of the program. Why did we lose Manoomin? Well, I think first and foremost because the colonizers had no clue about what Manoomin was other than it was a pest to them, something that got in the way of progress. And the first major impact was the logging era. This is a picture, I believe, of the Saginaw River. If you were a river rice, do you think you could sustain life on that river? Or if you were anything, a fish or anything? Mm-mm. The logging era was in the mid-1800s, and it was like at the heyday. And it started off pretty slow, right? Well, as technology started progressing, they started getting what are called big wheels, like you see here. They could haul logs out of the woods faster, so they could cut faster. Then they got the idea to put railroads out, which even increased the rate of logging further. Not only that, the wild rice beds were drained to facilitate putting railroad tracks through. I have documented a rice bed that was up by the Saginaw River, up by Bay City, that the railway went smack through it and destroyed it. So there was a lot of impact to logging. There was erosion, water quality issues, just the physical destruction. What they would do is they would store the logs in the wintertime, and then in the springtime when the waters were higher, they would run the logs down the river to the mills or out into the big lake areas. And it would just be this massive raft of logs. And you can see even on the shoreline, what once was probably really nice vegetated area is completely buried under logs. This is a picture of a portable mill, I guess you would call it, that's sitting in the river. They would actually mill the logs right there and dump all of the debris from logging right into the water, which was horrible for water quality. So that takes us to the next impact, which is damming of the rivers. This is an aerial photograph of Lac Vieux Desert, the homeland for my friend Roger. Lac Vieux Desert once had all of the bays that you see were full of wild rice. And back in the late 1800s, you see that wooden dam up in the corner. That wooden dam was built in the late 1870s. And it was to use the lake as a reservoir so the lake levels would rise. Then they could pull out the logs in the spring, let the river rush down and run the logs. Now, when I got this postcard from Land O'Lakes Historical Society, and the first thing I noticed is there's something unusual about this photograph. Can anybody see something unusual in this photograph? If you look closely at the dam, maybe on top of the dam. Do you see like something on the dam? Yeah. So I saw something on the dam and I zoomed in, and there's a woman, older woman, sitting down, and a younger woman dressed smartly with her rifle over her shoulder. What is so bizarre is the day before I read an article from an old magazine up there. They talked about this Major Thompson who owned a lodge at the dam, and he had a daughter, and his wife was half Ojibwe, and that's the daughter. Isn't that bizarre? And the next day I get a picture of him. Just a little side note. The dam was broke a few times and was repaired over the years, but then in the 1930s, Wisconsin Valley Power Authority took over. And now they use the river. It's the headwaters of the Wisconsin River, so they use it for hydropower. And they put a concrete structure in. Well, if you raise the water levels on wild rice, you basically kill it. It can't grow. It doesn't grow well in water more than 3 feet deep or so. In that deeper water, it has to spend all of its energy to grow taller rather than to put out seeds. And because it's a grass, it's an annual plant, it has to reseed itself every year. So by flooding the lake, they drowned out the rice. And because they drowned out the rice, the tribal folks had to leave because wild rice was a significant part of their income. It also affected the fisheries there too. And so the Lac Vieux Desert tribe, most of those folks had to move into Watersmeet. There was only like 1 or 2 people that stayed out at their tribal homelands after that happened. And it really impacted how many families rice there. Now there's only like 2 or 3, I think, that still rice. But it also affected the non-tribal people, a lot of shoreline erosion and things like that. Luckily, there was a big lawsuit. I won't go into too much detail, but they had to lower the water levels, and they've been trying to bring the rice back to that lake. But the dams happened all over Michigan to facilitate the logging. Another biggie, particularly in southeast Michigan, was industrialization. So you heard me mention the Monroe Marsh. The Monroe Marsh was internationally known as a place to go for duck hunting for the rich white folks. It was, as I said, 4,000 to 5,000 acres in size. It's also known for its water lotus, or they called it back then Egyptian lotus flowers. So people would come from all over just to pick these flowers. This is a map from 1820 that shows you what the river raisin's natural channel was. The islands that you see there, I don't think this one has a name on it. The first island at the mouth of the river was called Geyer Island or House Island. That was the place where the Potawatomi and the Shawnee used to be, right smack in the middle of the rice bed. Well, the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1830s decided we need to start dredging the mouths of all these rivers in Michigan. And this happened to almost all the rivers in Michigan, particularly the lower peninsula. All of our major rivers, and even some of the more minor ones, had wild rice beds at the mouths at the Great Lakes, and they were all destroyed. You can see they just started a channel through and bisected. You can see it says House Island. They bisected that island in 1835. This is a hand-drawn map that was done in 1900. This is a map of the vegetation, and this was a high water period in Lake Erie. So what's in red, those are the wild rice beds. Now in a high water period, you would have less rice, right? Because it doesn't like deep water. If you have a low water period on the Great Lakes, the rice beds expand because they can grow better. So this is a lot of rice. I can't imagine what it looked like in a low water period of time. Well, they kept dredging and straightening and dredging and straightening. It doesn't look too much like the first map at all. This is what it looks like today with the rice overlaying. There is nothing left of this once amazing, beautiful marsh. And here's another view. This was what happened all around the state along our coastlines. Another cause of the loss of Manoomin here was draining. So back in the early 1900s, we had a type of farming that came about called muck farming. I don't know, have any of you heard of muck farming before? A few? But before the muck farming happened, we had a malaria epidemic. And I had no idea about the tie-in with rice and malaria until I came across the very first mention of the rice at Tawas Lake. And that was in American Medical Association write-up about sources of malaria. And they mentioned Tawas Lake and how it was full of rice and a potential source of malaria, and what should they be draining the wetlands around there. So I began to research it further, and apparently we had quite an epidemic of malaria in the mid-1800s, and almost every illness that people had was somehow related to malaria. People didn't know where it came from. They came up with all kinds of reasons. They thought it came from rotting vegetation, rotting animals. They thought that it was some kind of stellar event, all kinds of things. They had no idea that it was transported by mosquitoes in those days, but it was always associated with swampland. So their way to prevent it was to drain the swampland. And they, in fact, had a goal to drain the entire state of Michigan of all of its swamplands to keep people from getting this disease. And if you look at maps today, this was so depressing. This reminded me of cuts on Mother Earth, bleeding cuts on Mother Earth. These are all ditches. Ovid Centers and the Maple River is kind of up a little bit north of Lansing. All of these are ditches that were dug to drain off the wetlands. And you'll see this all over the state. And this was also very detrimental to wild rice. Such was the campaign against malaria that they said, about, I think, 1903, the news came from across the big pond that mosquitoes were the vectors for malaria. So the war was on. They started draining even more intensely, and they started spraying the surface of waters with kerosene and gas and oil to smother the larvae of the mosquitoes. And that also is very detrimental, as you can imagine. wild rice. Well, I was at work one day, and I got a call from Frank Edwagijik, who is a tribal elder from Little Traverse Bay Bands, and he said, "Hey, Barb, you heard of this little town north of Grand Rapids called Grant, Michigan?" He said, there's a place over there that we have stories of my people harvesting Manoomin, but it's an onion farm now." And I said, "I don't know anything about that, but I'll see what I can find out." So for those of you unfamiliar with this part of the state, that little red drop is right where Grant, Michigan is. This is the only photo I could find of this lake. It's called Rice Lake. And you can see there's bulrushes in the front. They used to be harvested for basket making. But in the back is the wild rice. And Rice Lake was about 3.5 miles long, and it was surrounded by marshland. And I believe this to be the largest inland rice bed that we had here in Michigan. There was a man who eventually purchased all of that property and was trying to figure out what to do with it. He tried to make a hunting club, and all the locals complained about that. So about 7 farmers got together, and they decided that they wanted to drain the lake and turn it into a muck farm. Muck farms basically grow root crops, so onions, rutabagas, turnips, things like that, because of the soil being what it is. It was a big deal over in the Scandinavian countries, so as those folks came and immigrated here, they brought that farming method with them. So they got permission from the Drain Commissioner. In 1917, they started. They dug a ditch 5 miles long, 20 feet wide. And this is what it looks like in 1955. I mean, this just blows my mind. First, that anyone would even think about draining a lake. No thought at all, I'm sure, to the tribal people who are using this as their staple food, right? Here's the maps by comparison. Rice Lake, when it was still around with the marsh, and no Rice Lake at all. You can go there today, and you can drive. There's a road. You can see it goes right through the middle of where the lake was. And you can stand there, and you can see where the lake was. I mean, the forest around the marsh is still there. And it's a very, very sad feeling. If you buy onions, sometimes you can look on the tag, and it'll say from Grant, Michigan. And it's a very good chance that those onions came from Rice Lake. This happened in many places. I actually thought about writing another book about draining of lakes here, but that's even harder to find. That information is even harder to find, so I don't know if I'll be successful. Of course, this is where we start to lift you back up. So, yes, all of these horrible things happened, and believe me, I was very depressed for a long time researching this book. I couldn't believe what I was learning. But right now, there's so much work going on around the Upper and Lower Peninsulas on restoration. It's so impressive. Now, you would think, I'm certain that the tribal folks, and those of you here who are tribal can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure you'll agree that there was restoration going on all the time by the tribal folks. The non-tribal hunters particularly noticed that the rice beds were disappearing, and they were not getting as many ducks as they wanted. So they figured, oh geez, we better start planting some more rice to grow it, to get it to come back. So this is a picture from the 1940s of a guy throwing a mud ball with rice seed in it. So I made a map, of course, of all of the historic seeded locations. These do not include tribal restoration work. This is all colonizer work, mostly DNR, Forest Service, and hunter groups. And there was much more happening. It's just I didn't have exact locations to put a point on a map for. But they were very concerned about duck hunting. In fact, even the railroad got involved. 1910 newspaper article talks about the railroad that goes across by Kalamazoo, putting seed out in water bodies as the trains go by to try to get more duck habitat. Seney National Wildlife Refuge up in the UP, they started seeding rice. They had 30 years of planting, almost 33,500 pounds of seed. And there's no rice there today. They planted in places it wouldn't grow, and they just didn't know, and they didn't ask the people who would know, right? There's that, and there's that. This was shocking to me. So there was a couple times in Michigan's history that I was able to find in the European history where the topic of growing rice as an agricultural crop came up. And they wanted to use it as a breakfast cereal. Well, the farmers who were already growing rice or growing other crops for breakfast cereal, they're like, no freaking way is this going to happen. And they were so against it, partly because it brought in blackbirds, because blackbirds love to eat Manoomin, and they didn't want the blackbirds eating their crops. But they made threats of lynching and white capping. And anybody here know what white capping means? Have you heard that term before? I never had heard that term before either. Well, it's way worse than lynching. It's like where people go and they burn your house and they kill your family and they kill your livestock. And these farmers were threatening this if you grew wild rice. So nobody grew it as an agricultural crop, which I guess threats work, eh? It's kind of a good thing they didn't. So it's interesting if you look at the attitude of the colonizers with Manoomin, how it's changed over the years. So in 1918, the State Game, Fish, and Forest Fire Department, which is today's DNR, said that all of our water should be stocked with rice. In 1916 to 1919, when landowners would give them property, they would turn them into game refuges, and they'd have these great big celebrations and invite the public. And one of the things they would do is give away barrels of wild rice to people to plant, which was pretty interesting. And they have detailed records of who got how many barrels and what area they planted in. And then they also seeded themselves different places around the state. But they went and checked these rice beds a year or 2 years after they had planted them. Mind you, they probably didn't know what they were doing. They didn't have the luxury of internet, and they obviously didn't talk to the tribal folks. But the rice didn't grow where they planted it. So they came to the conclusion that we should not plant rice at all in Michigan. Well, fast forward to today. Now we have the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative. All 12 federally recognized tribes are part of it. Several state and federal agencies are part of it. There's partnerships with the universities and all kinds of folks. And they're working on a Manoomin stewardship plan right now. And it's in the legal process through the legislature of being named as Michigan's state native grain, which is unbelievable to me after working in this so long that it's gotten that far, especially when you look at the history of what's happened. So that's pretty exciting. A lot of times when I do talks, or even other times when I'm not doing talks, I get emails about, hey, we have a pond or a creek that runs through our property and we want to plant wild rice. How do we do it? And there's a lot of things that have to be considered. Habitat has to be considered. Whether you have people living around you that will care for Manoomin or putting chemicals to kill Manoomin. Do you have a lot of carp? Are there a lot of geese? There's all kinds of things to think about when you're doing restoration work. So we did a partnership. This was, gosh, I think back in 2015 with the DNR. We have, gosh, I don't know how many tribes are represented there. Several tribes represented there. Some friends and Chad Fedewa from the DNR. Have you been down to Lansing and seen the Maple River flooding on 127? It's that big wetland on both sides of the highway, kind of by St. John's. We thought that would be a great place to plant Manoomin. So we had people come down, we did a water ceremony there, and we planted Manoomin. And I put this little video together. This is, it's okay. I mean, I was early on in my making video career, so I would do a much better job today, but you get a sense of what it looks like to see Manoomin. I love that picture. Reminds me of a flock of birds in the sky. So we did have Manoomin come and grow for about 5 years, but then it kept getting browsed. So the seeds that were in the sediment, they can stay viable for a long time, but after a while, when it wasn't getting to reseed itself, it just ran out of seed. And we've tried replanting a few times, but the conditions there's too many carp, there's lots of carp. There's also lots of nutrients in there, and it's just not a good spot, unfortunately. But gosh, I had visions of this beautiful rice beds on both sides of the highway where, tribal folks could be out harvesting, and maybe someday. So the last chapter in the book, of course, you can't talk about Manoomin without talking about eating it, right? So all these folks in these pictures here contributed recipes. They represent tribal folks from all over the Upper and Lower Peninsula. You may know a few folks in here. I want you to close your eyes and answer this question because I find that generally audiences who come to this talk are embarrassed to say yes. So close your eyes and nobody will see. If you say yes, you can just raise your hand. How many of you watch American Idol? Sweet. A few people do. Okay, you can open your eyes now. There were 4 of you. So I got a call from... So if you watch American Idol, you may know... Oh, what's this guy's name? Taylor Hicks. Did you remember Taylor Hicks winning American Idol? So I got a call from this production company and they were doing a show in Michigan called State Plate. Taylor Hicks was the star host of it. I have no idea who Taylor Hicks was because I don't watch that show. But he came down and they filmed a segment on wild rice as one of the iconic foods in Michigan. So you can see, oh look, there's Kelly who's sitting in the front row. She got to meet Taylor. Shiloh and Roger and I. And you can watch this episode. I don't know if it's still on Amazon Prime or not, but look up Michigan and you can see Taylor. I try to see the moccasins he's wearing. I made those and I still have those. And I guess he has a group called a posse of fans. You can close your eyes again. Who's a member of the posse? Yeah, I try to sell them to the posse, but. So that's kind of a trip through the story of Manoomin that I learned anyway from my research, and it's kind of a sad story. It's very much a sad story of what happened over time, but there is a lot of hope in what's going on now, and I think that we've turned things around and it's going to have a good outcome. I do have books for sale with me, which you can get at the reception afterward. I want to thank Dave, the late Dave Shenanigans, Dave Ba, for donating this picture of Manoomin with a little baby hummingbird at the top. There's a story to that I'll tell you another time. So we have some time for questions before the reception. So if anybody has any. Thank you, Barb. Yeah, you're welcome.
So we have time for questions. Raise your hand and I'll pass you the microphone. Any questions?
Ani. So is there any success stories with the tribes planning and successfully growing in their areas, Manoomin?
Yeah, there are success stories. I know Little Traverse Bay Bands has been seeding several lakes up in their area and have had a lot of success. I know that Nottawasapi Huron Band has been planting the river rice in the Kalamazoo River, Pine Creek and Nottawa Creek, and it's amazing how well that's doing there. I think Pokagon Band's also had success with river rice as well. Lac Vieux Desert and Keweenaw Bay, they've been doing plantings on Forest Service lands. And I haven't heard the latest update, but they were doing pretty well. The Sioux Tribe and Bay Mills are also doing some planting, and I saw one of the Lake Spectacle Lake, and the rice was looking pretty good there. So Little River Band, I don't know. Some share more information than others. And I'm not too plugged into the current happenings with restoration, but I do know that they are being successful, and they're also doing a lot of research to find out what are the optimum conditions using Western science approach. Yeah. The average is 3 or 4 questions per talk, so I'm trying to beat that. So just think up anything, like where'd you get your jacket, or anything. Do I dye my hair? No.
I'm curious about some of the locations, the dots that you had on the map. Are many of them quite successful? And also, as far as harvesting goes, like, can anyone go and harvest on these at these locations? Are they mostly on tribal lands, or?
That's That's 3 questions, so we're almost over the record. Let's see. The first question, excuse me. There's only probably maybe half a dozen places that are of lake rice that are of a size that can sustain harvesting. There's no regulations in Michigan, or I don't think any of the tribes have established tribal regulations completely yet. I don't know. Has Sag Chip done that yet? Do you know? Yeah. So there's, in most of the rice beds, in fact, the majority of them do not occur on tribal lands, which is part of the problem, right? So, and then the other thing is the river rice, native people can harvest, but non-native people can't. Nobody can mess with that stuff because it's a threatened plant species. Harvesting rice is very labor intensive, and you have to know what you're doing, especially for the processing part. A lot of people, they think, oh yeah, we can go knock rice, they get a couple 100 pounds, and then they're like, now what do we do? And so it's something that's evolving, especially with the Wild Rice Initiative and working with the tribes on, I know the tribes are looking at regulations, a lot of them are within their own tribal governments. And then there's the question of the statewide non-tribal people, and how do you deal with that and not have, but it's so much work that I don't think there's very many non-tribal ricers, to be honest with you. I've known the ones who do it, and it's just so much work. Even a lot of the tribal folks do it for a while, but it's so much work. It's hard work. Is that all the questions? Did I get them all?
One here, and then I'll come around the other side.
I'm glad that you included some recipes. So thank you for that. But what is your favorite wild rice dish?
I'm lazy, so I like to cook it, and then I add blueberries and honey and cinnamon to it and have it for breakfast. That's probably my favorite way. But if other people make it, I like the casseroles with chicken in it. I like that a lot. And then Shiloh has a really good recipe for an autumn salad that knocks your socks off. That's what's in that state plate show.
Has anybody tried to put wild rice into the Chippewa? Our river, the river that comes along here?
I don't know, to be honest with you. You would want to plant river rice, and I'm not familiar with the Chippewa River. I have never paddled on it. I'm just not familiar with it as to whether the river would be, in the present day conditions, would be suitable. You have to have kind of slower moving, like water and bayous, real fast water or unobstructed. It's a little bit harder for the rice to take hold. But I would consult with the Saginaw Chippewa tribal folks who may be here who could answer that question. Yes, we broke the record.
My question is about the malaria.
Mm-hmm.
Was malaria always here, or did the settlers bring in malaria? Or
The records, most of those records are from not the tribal world, they're from the colonizer world. So I don't think in any of the things I read that they had interviewed tribal people. I don't know how malaria came to be here. I just know it was here then. That's as far back as my medical expertise goes.
With the Seven Prophecy story, where was the rice found that grew on the water? Was that, do you know where the first site was, or?
Yeah, I've heard that. I think it was what the heck is the name of the island up in Minnesota? Which one? Thank you, Madeline Island. I knew it was a name of somebody. Yeah, Madeline Island. But certainly, I mean, that's certainly it was the route that the folks came, as I was told, through Lake Detroit, and that wave of people would certainly have ran into rice there too. But I'm not the expert on that. You'd have to talk to the other tribal people.
Was curious watching your video where he was tossing it out, and then the photos of the Anishinaabe male Nene with the mud bombs.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any success either way? More success?
I have never tried the mud balls, and I know that was tried down in Monroe, and they didn't have any success, but I don't know if that was related to the mud balls. I think it's not. I don't know if it's to protect them from bottom feeders, like maybe the carp, because they will eat the seeds from the bottom. But it's certainly way more labor intensive than just, and it's more natural the way that the plant drops the seeds by sowing it, by tossing it, than a mud ball. But maybe in Minnesota, Wisconsin area, they might use that technique, but I don't know where.
Hi.
Hi.
Back to mosquitoes.
Yes.
I know I did hear you say that you weren't familiar with the larger story, but do you know, was there talk in terms of the timeline? Was there talk of malaria before they started destroying the rice fields? I mean, I'm wondering, was it the balance of it being destroyed that made it more prevalent? Do you have any sense of that?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So you're asking say it again.
So okay, so my question is a timeline question. That we know malaria was a problem, but was it a problem before the rice fields were destroyed, or was it a problem that came in after the rice fields started disappearing?
I think that it came simultaneously with the logging era, because I know that some people blamed logging activities on disturbing the soil, and that it came up out of the soil. That was one of the beliefs too. And I'm sure it spread more with the logging towns popping up around.
Thank you for your talk. I had two questions. One was if there were any restoration for the river Manoomin, or if most of that was just for the Manoomin that grows in swamps. And then the second question is, why are carp such a problem? Which you kind of already answered, but.
So the first answer is that the Potawatomi tribes, mostly, I think Gun Lake does mostly lake rice, but I'm not for sure about that, but I think it's mostly lake rice. The Pokagon band of Potawatomi and the Nottawasapi Huron band do mostly river rice. And again, they're located in southwest Michigan in the lower part of the state, where river rice is the more dominant species, and it doesn't grow really north too much. So I think maybe there's a couple of locations like up in here, but for the most part, the range of it in Michigan lends itself to the Potawatomi tribes areas. Carp, you asked about carp. In the springtime, carp are very active, doing their swishy swashy around in the sediment, which disrupts the plants from growing. They eat the seeds. That's a big one too.
Thank you so much. I was going to ask, how does Michigan compare in its history with Manoomin with Minnesota, Wisconsin? I feel like Minnesota and Wisconsin is where my mind goes when I've heard of wild rice and Manoomin. So was Michigan especially efficient in its ability to just decimate the wild rice? So how did that not happen in Minnesota and Wisconsin to the same degree, or is it? I don't know.
The difference, what I've been told by people who are experts in the whole region, is that we had more physical destruction to the land here. We have a lot more coastline too, and that's where a lot of our destruction of Manoomin occurred. And it happened, how do I say this? It happened more quickly here. And also that from what I understand, and again, this is coming from tribal people that I've spoken with, that there was more impact geographically here to the tribes than in Wisconsin, Minnesota. That's what I've been told by some tribal people. So the traditions also were probably held together a little better there. And their rice beds, they have some pretty large rice beds still intact. And I think they also have large reservations there, I believe, especially like in Wisconsin, probably Minnesota too. I'm not real familiar, but that land would have been more protected because they had held on to them more. But Michigan's not mentioned as a wild rice place hardly at all in any of the books about rice, which is why I decided to see what we did and didn't have. We should be on the books.
So this will be the final question, but then I have a comment after.
I was just wondering about whether there'd been any significant damage to the rice lands prior to the 1800s.
I would say probably not.
So it really
I can't
was
say
the,
for sure, but the written record, as far as colonizers go, only goes back so far. And I have to look at landscape level impact. And prior to logging, there was the whole beaver thing where they almost wiped out all the beaver. But that probably did impact rice too, as I think about it, because of the impacts of flooding and changing the habitats and stuff.
So before we go and move to the reception, Barb, can you tell us just a little bit about the objects that you brought and what they'll see when they come over to the reception?
Oh, sure. So I just brought some ricing sticks for you to look at. Paddle that's used for parching. I brought a couple pair of very well-used ricing moccasins, not the ones that Mr. Taylor Hicks wore. Those are in a museum now. Just kidding. And I brought I brought a winnowing basket and also some Manoomin that's still in the hall that had been parched, so you can see what that looks like. And then after it's been processed, so you can see what it looks like. Which it does not look like the rice you find in the store, which is almost always paddy rice, just so you know. It's not true wild rice.
Well, please join me in thanking Barb again for this really wonderful talk. Really appreciate
You're
it.
welcome. Thank you for coming.
So I hope to see you all at the reception. It's at the Clark, just out in the corridor, down slightly and on your left. See you there.